Hello everyone. On behalf of the Jahangir Nicholson Art Foundation, I welcome all of you to today's conversation with author Tony Joseph. This talk is presented as part of the outreach for our ongoing exhibition at the gallery, which presents works by the artist Sahej Rahal, who's also on the call with us, and Sahej and I will both be in conversation with Tony Joseph. Sahej's exhibition is titled Ancestors. The exhibition itself is an exploration of civilizational time, histories, and cultures. It speaks of the process by which we construct historical narratives, taking into account material evidence and archaeological remains, and the way that we connect these to build the narrative. The exhibition draws from speculative archaeology to think about also the biases and the erasures that are involved in the telling of history. So within this context, it is an honor and a privilege for us to have this conversation with author Tony Joseph. Tony's book, which is called Early Indians, The Story of Our Ancestors and Where We Came From, unravels surprising evidence on the interconnectedness of our society, of our modern day present society and civilization. So I think in an increasingly, like we live in a time that is increasingly divisive and communal. The notions of purity, of race and ethnicity, our worldview, which is shaped by the place that we belong to, the sense of belonging, our claims on place, our claims on the past, on history, which kind of build our worldview and like make us feel like we belong. So all of these sort of things, also about the insider-outsider thing, that who belongs and who doesn't. So I think all of these notions are things that are completely like Tony's book literally pulls the ground from these constructs and the idea of race and purity. So I think in this way, I think it'll be really fascinating, and we are really privileged to have Tony. So thank you so much, Tony. Actually reconstructs notions of, I think someone has their audio on. Yeah. So Tony's book reconstructs the notions of our origins and everything that we thought we knew about our civilization and evolution. And I think what's very interesting about Tony's book is that he's done this through a great amount of research, collating papers from archaeology to very recent genetic technologies, which research through DNA evidence from ancient remains to like population, different population genetics. And the other thing is that the book is written in such a sort of simple way. You don't need to be an archaeologist or an anthropologist or a geneticist to really understand, because he's really broken it down in a very simple way for people to understand. So I think it's in this moment that it is a very, very important book. It is very important for people to read this. I think everyone should read it, and because it really changes everything that we know, we think that we know. Just to give a little background about Tony, he's been a journalist for over 3 decades. He was the editor of the News World. His book, and I think since the past decade, Tony says he has been focusing entirely on this. I think he began with who were the Harappans, and it led him into many, many other areas of our origins. So I think, and thank you, Tony, for being here and to have this conversation with us. Sahej and I are both very excited to do this with you. I think your book has also been a great source of reference for Sahej in building the ideas for his work. So I think it'll be great to hear from Sahej. So over to you, Sahej. And then after that, we can start the questions and the conversation.
Thanks, Puja, and thank you, Tony. It's really an honor to be in conversation with you today, and thanks everyone for joining us, and Tamara for organizing this. Uh, Tony, I have your book here with me. It's a first edition I got in 2018. And really, thank you for writing this book. I mean, it's really been an education for me, just on a personal level, and even in putting together this show. The kind of fundamental idea that, like, Pooja and I were kind of tackling. Uh, was the fact that, like, we come from a shared history of a diverse group of people living together, and that kind of became to borrow your term, the pizza base on which we kind of put together this exhibition. Yeah, it's honestly, I'm really excited to be talking to you today, and yeah, with that, I thought we could open up the conversation. If you could just briefly kind of take us through, just for people who also haven't read this fantastic book, just the kind of broader argument that you make in terms of how India has been, the Indian subcontinent was populated over the years, during prehistory, through a series of migrations. Uh, and and then we can kind of take it from there. Thanks.
Sorry, we can't. Tony, you're on mute. Just 1 second.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So thank you very much, Sahej, and it's a pleasure to be here. And the exhibition that I have seen, I really love the way that it has been conceived and put together. About the peopling of India, and the surprising thing is that until a few years ago, if someone had asked me or anyone else about the peopling of India and how it happened, or what period and how exactly, we wouldn't have had a clear answer. And that's not just about India, about peopling of the world itself. We could have arrived at various guesstimates, various guesses based on archaeology, philology, epigraphy, and so on. But no clearer answers were possible. But all that changed in the last 7-8 years, thanks mainly to a relatively new discipline called population genetics. Population genetics, which in these years acquired the ability to extract and analyze DNA from people who lived thousands or even tens of thousands of years ago. Until then, they used to look at DNA from people who are currently living. And by looking at that, they could figure out which population groups were related to which other population groups and how closely or not. But they could not figure out how those relationships came about. And that is what has changed. And that now allows us to, because they can now see from DNA collected from people who lived tens of thousands of years ago, or thousands of years ago in various archaeological sites, we can see which population groups moved into which area at what point, when. And that is what has brought clarity, much greater clarity than we ever had, into how the various regions of the world got populated. And the story of how India got populated is only a subset of that. Because in the last few years, hundreds and hundreds of ancient DNA samples have been recovered from all over the world, across Eurasia, in the Americas, East Asia, all over the world. That gives us this clarity. So now looking at this, what we can say is that all large population groups today are the result of multiple migrations that happened in the distant past, especially in prehistory. Europe, in just the last 10,000 years, saw its population change dramatically, at least twice. We know that the Americas were populated by at least 3 migrations from Asia, thousands of years before the Europeans ever landed there. We know the East Asia has seen its population change over twice at least in just the last 4,000 years or so. So this is how we have got an understanding of how population groups formed. But one might ask, there are migrations that happen all the time across space and time. And so how can we put a structure to it to understand what migrations caused what population groups to form. There is a way to understand it, and that's to realize that essentially there are 4 classes of migrations that shaped world populations everywhere. 4 classes of migrations. When you say these 4 classes of migrations, what you mean, these migrations, as you will see when I talk about it, are not things that happened. They were not flashes in the pan. They are not things that lasted years or even decades. And in many cases, not even centuries. They lasted thousands of years. So that's the kind of long range migrations that happened in prehistory that shaped much of the world's population. What are those 4 classes of migrations? The first class of migration were the out of Africa migrations, which you might have heard about, which is around 70,000 years ago. A group of modern humans who moved out of the Horn of Africa into the Arabian Peninsula around 70,000 years ago. And then over the next thousands of years went on to populate the rest of the world. There might have been only a few hundred people to begin with, but over thousands of years, they expanded. The last continent they entered or peopled was the Americas. And that's probably around 16,000 years ago or somewhat earlier. So that's the time it took, 70,000 years ago to around 16,000 years ago or earlier, at the period within which the world got populated. And while they were peopling the world like this, there's another event that happened, which is the glacial age that happened between around 29,000 years ago to around 12,000 years ago, roughly. That's around 17,000 years ago, a long period of time. And when during glacial periods, the world's water gets locked up in ice in many parts of the world. And the consequence of that is that there is very little water evaporation happening, which means there is very few, the rains are far less, which means large parts of the world get arid, not livable. And the consequence of that, that these expanding groups of modern humans who are expanding out of Africa into the rest of the world got separated from each other for large periods of time, during which period they also accumulated some genetic differences between themselves, which we can see today. But you must remember that all modern humans, everywhere in the world, share 99.9% of their DNA. So these differences are really minor in the larger scheme of things. Now, when you see the second class of migrations begin when this glacial age ends, there is a sudden warming up of the world. There are rains, deserts become lush forests. It's a period of plenty, dramatic changes that happened. Oh, when you say dramatic, in prehistory, everything dramatic, we're talking about not years, we're talking about hundreds of years. So you see these changes taking place. And the consequence of that is that we see modern humans in various parts of the world trying to experimenting with agriculture. One of the earliest modern humans to experiment with agriculture actually were in Southeast Asia. And you can only experiment with the material that nature in your region has given you. And what they experimented with were tubers, yams, bananas, etc., which did not ultimately lead on to immediate lifestyle change. But there were people who were in a luckier situation where they were in regions where they had wild varieties of cereal to domesticate. And cereal domestication changed the game. Again, it happened over large periods of time because of two things. One, productivity, of course, but even more important is that the cereals, that is wheat, barley, rice, etc., they can be stored, which means that that changes the whole game, because what you're saying is that now you are producing stuff which not only sustains the people for the period, for the year, but there is things that you can keep for the future, which means it can be used for other things. And the second thing that happens when people, which has consequences, we'll come to that later. Second thing that happens is that whenever people took to this agriculture, especially in this where people had this ability to cultivate cereal, that is Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and China, these were the very early agricultural regions, all of which had cereal cultivation. You see people settling down, their lifestyle changed. They became from hunter-gatherers over thousands of years into farmers. And when settled farming happens, natural consequence we see in all places is a dramatic population explosion. Farmers grow at a much faster rate than hunter-gatherer populators anyway. The consequence of that population explosion are migrations. Migrations that lasted, again, thousands of years from all these regions that took to agriculture. So when you see, this is the second class of migrations, agriculture-related migrations. They expanded into all the nearby regions in all these regions. And that is the second, that's the second class of migrations that changed world demography. The third class of migrations happened when a small, this class of migrations we can see happened because of the human mastery over nature to some extent. While the first class of migrations, the out of Africa migrations happened mostly, they were determined by climatic factors, when routes opened up or closed, when glacial age began or stopped. And that would have been the case for other animals as well. So, what you have to see is that these are global factors that are operating behind these large migrations. So the third class of migrations happened when a group of modern humans in Central Asian steppe region, vast grasslands, figured out the wheel, the wagons, the mastery of a horse, metallurgy, all of these things over a period of time. And the consequence of that, especially this is the first time that any modern human population group had that kind of mobility. So this is a migration that is caused by man's mastery over mobility, you could say. And this population group expanded into Europe, into West, towards the West, into Europe, all the way up to Iceland. And they changed the demography of Central Asia itself, West Asia, South Asia, all the way up to China. So this is the third class of migrations driven by mastery over mobility, and which changed the demography of a very large part of the world. We can see these migrations across this region also maps perfectly onto the distribution of Indo-European languages, which we'll come to later. So this is the third class of migrations. The fourth class of migrations or our parents or grandparents have direct experience of in some way or the other, which is the colonial migrations, which happened because when a small group of humans in Western Europe figured out how to travel large distances overseas, and that caused them moving into regions that are already populated, just like the steppe pastoralists did, and changing the demography across large parts of the world, in the Americas, significantly, in Australia, and in many other parts of the world. So you could say these are the four classes of migrations that shaped the demography of large parts of the world. Each of them lasted sometimes hundreds and hundreds of years, sometimes thousands of years. And this is what you need to understand when you're talking about how the world demography formed. Now the question is, now how do we apply this to the Indian population formation? The simple answer is that the first class of migrations, the out of Africa migrants, reached India around 65,000 years ago. We know this from the fact that there is fossil and other archaeological evidence from Australia and Southeast Asia that says modern humans were there at least by 59,000 years ago in Australia, 63,000 years ago in Southeast Asia. And since these groups would have had to go through the Indian subcontinent to reach all these regions over thousands of years, it's a reasonable assumption that they were in the Indian subcontinent by around 65,000 years ago. So this is the first class of migrations that shaped Indian demography. Caused the first peopling of India. We could call them first Indians. The amazing thing is that the first Indians still form the base of the Indian demographic piece, in the sense that most population groups in India today carry 50 to 65% of their ancestry from these first Indians. So it's not correct that you have to go to Andaman Islands to see the descendants of the first Indians. You only have to look into the mirror or look around to see them. Of course, in Andaman Islands, you could see people who have mixed less with the later migrants. Sorry, but but the point is that the first Indians formed the demographic base of the Indian population. The second class of migrations happened when agriculture begins in northwestern India, in a place, the earliest evidence is from a place called Mehergarh, the Balochistan province of Pakistan, and that goes back to around 9,000 years ago, or 7,000 BCE. And once farming began in that region, it spreads across all through northwestern India, very large region, and which ultimately directly results in the rise of the Harappan civilization, which reached its mature stage from around 2600 BCE to around 1900 BCE, 700 years. And who are these people who created the agricultural revolution and the subsequent Harappan civilization? Genetic evidence now tells us that this is a mixed population of the first Indians and another population related to the early farmers of Iran. So this is the mixed population that drove the agricultural revolution in the northwestern India. And you must remember that when it begins around 9,000 years ago, 7,000 BC, and then expands, there is population expansion happening, right? Changing the demography in all those regions. And then when the Harappan civilization started declining around 1900 BC because of a long drought that affected other civilizations as well during the same period, what you see is people moving out, the Harappans moving out into the east, into the North India, and south into South India, taking their culture, their languages, everything, their practices with them, and thus becoming the ancestors of both North Indians and South Indians. And so this is the second class of migrations that shaped the Indian demography, and that comes from northwestern India. There is also a third migration, not third class, because this is also an agriculture-related migration. There's a third migration that happens from the east. This is as a result of China taking to agriculture. Then again, as we have seen earlier, large migrations begin that come all across Southeast Asia, and the tail end of it reaches India around 4,000 years ago or a little later. And these people brought Austroasiatic languages, which are spoken by tribals in central India and eastern India, Khasi, Mundari, these are the languages. And Austroasiatic languages are linked to the Mon-Khmer family of languages spoken today. They belong to the Mon-Khmer family of languages spoken today in Vietnam, Cambodia, and many parts of Thailand, etc., of Southeast Asia. So this is the third migration that happened that influenced Indian culture, demography, and everything. The fourth migration happened from the steppe that we talked about, which changed European demography and changed the demography of the whole. They reached India between, genetic evidence tells us, between 2000 BCE, that's 4,000 years ago, and 3,500 years ago, 2000 BCE to 1500 BCE. So this is the four classes of migrations that shaped Indian demography. And this is not something that we knew earlier with this clarity. And the important thing to remember is that this model or this way of population formation, there's nothing surprising about it. All population groups in the world are the result of, all large population groups in the world are the result of large, multiple migrations that happened in the ancient past. So that is the shortest answer one can give to the question of how did the peopling of India happen and over what period of time.
Thank you so much, Tony. So I think, like when people speak about themselves or their belonging to a space or ethnic groups, especially people who believe in more sort of purist ideas, I think your book and your research already kind of says that we are all initially migrants from Africa, even in India. And then all the consecutive migrations that you've spoken about from the steppes and from Southeast Asia and the Australasian influence and all of that. So it'd be interesting to know what are the other sort of, facts, things that we thought were facts, which are actually myths that has been revealed through your research. Like how does the blurring of lines between fact and myth drive our present worldviews of history and prehistory? Some of it you've explained through the migration, but also, in terms of, we were also thinking about archaeological remains of Harappa itself, whereas where you have, say, the very famous figure of the girl, the Harappan girl, which is termed as dancing girl, or the bearded man from the bust of the bearded man from Mohenjo-daro, which is also referred to as the priest cave. So there's also that those kind of things, the kind of myth making with how we term, and since we come from a background of visuals being in the art field, it's interesting how these images are read and the narratives are constructed. So those kind of biases in breaking these facts and fictions, if you can speak a little bit about that.
I'll come to the images a little later, because I think the point that you made of facts, fiction, fantasy, these new understandings of how world population formed and how Indian population formed. And one thing I should have said earlier is that these migrations they resulted in a huge mixture of these populations to differing degrees. But after all these migrations arrived, by around 1500 BCE, all the migrations are in, right? And between 1500 BCE to the roughly beginning of the Common Era, what genetics says is a huge mixing that happened. So much so that no matter which population group you take today in whatever remote area, you would still see that it is the mixed population group to differing extent in different regions. Now, what this has changed, this understanding has changed, is one major myth or misunderstanding that we have had about our history, which even today continues to distort the way that we see things and create tensions unnecessarily, which is the wrong understanding that Indian civilization is unisource or follows from the Sanskrit, Vedic, Arya culture. What we now have seen is that the Sanskrit, Vedic, Arya culture that follows the arrival of the steppe migrants is a significant and important part of the Indian civilization, but it is not the earliest or the only part of Indian civilization. The Harappan civilization precedes that, and in fact, it has left a very large mark on Indian culture and society. In the language of the pizza of my book, the Harappan civilization is the sauce that spreads over the base of the Indian demographic pizza, especially when their civilization declines and people move, and that they take their culture, their practices across, and that accounts for many of the commonalities that we see today between different parts of the country. That goes back to the Harappans and their civilization, the way that we build houses around courtyards, the way that our kitchen utensils look across. You would see that the way that they were built in the Harappan civilization. Some of the stories that in the Panchatantra, you would see reflections of that in some of the images from the Harappan civilization. There's one particular that reminds you of the story of the crow that puts stones in the water jar to be able to drink the water. There are game boards and chess and things like that they played with, which immediately relate to us. There are pictures of images of what can only be deities because people submit before them. They are placed within the people tree. We can immediately relate to that, or even relate to the earliest gods. The images that we have in the Indian culture belongs to the yakshas and yakshis, all of which are related to the trees. So these are the underlying. So the important thing to remember is that the understanding that we are a unisource civilization is not correct. It's a misunderstanding. The Arya Vedic Sanskrit culture is an important and significant part of the Indian culture, but it's not the only one or the earliest one. So this this changes the way that we look at ourselves. And it also, if it is not unisource, what is it then? What we have to realize is that this is a multi-source civilization. We have created a unique civilization out of multiple streams of people and their culture and their experiences that they brought to this land of ours over thousands of years. So without understanding that, understanding this, we will not be able to sustain what we have created. So this is the first, what shall I say, correction of the myths that we have about ourselves. The second myth, which is related, is that if you look at the rest of the population, you would see that most of the rest of the population has almost always considered the tribals to be very different and distinct from them. Now we know that's complete bunkum. Why? Because the rest of the population has no clearer, no closer relatives anywhere in the world than the tribals. Why? Because we all share the ancestry. This is the largest ancestry that we all share of the first Indians. And that's an ancestry that is unique to South Asia today. You will not see it outside of South Asia. That's why we can clearly say that for the rest of the population, there is no closer relatives anywhere than the tribals in the Indian subcontinent. All this applies, all this, whenever I talk about India, I mean the Indian subcontinent, not just the Republic of India as it is today. So that's a significant change. So I can go on in this vein much longer. So these are some of the myths that are commonly that we had that we now need to change because of the way that we now understand our history.
Thanks, Tony. While you were speaking, a few things that kind of, just came to my mind were, the words from Rahat Indori's poem that Sabhi ka khoon shamil hai is mitti mein, this land is like, has all our blood in it. And that is kind of like what the excavation of history that you are doing as well is like kind of just reminding us that we all belong here.
Absolutely.
So thank you for that. And another thing that really struck me was when you said that the idea of race or a pure race is not, there's no such thing. It's a fiction. We all have the genes of multitudes of, that have been developed over these series of migrations. I think that is a really helpful idea. That on the level of bare life, we are all brothers in that sense. And another thing that also struck me was when you were speaking about how agriculture and food developed, was the fact that like the food that we eat, the languages that we carry with us, and also the technologies that we've developed, be it for farming or the stories we tell as well, are largely the product of our way of navigating the environment that our ancestors found themselves in, as opposed to any kind of myth or fiction or narrative. And just going forward from there, I was wondering if you could maybe speak about one of the sort of starkest kind of realities that sort of shaped Indian civilization. And that is the Indian caste system, and what is the the research that you have found tell us about, like where does the origins of the Indian caste system begin? If you could kind of tell us about that.
Yeah. This is one of the myths that will have to change, because one of the assumptions has been that the caste system began with the arrival of the migrants from the steppe, the idea of brought into Aryan languages and new practices of ritual sacrifices and so on. But we now know from the genetic evidence that this doesn't sit with the facts. As we said, what we know is that between around 2000 BCE and 100 CE, that's nearly 2000 years, the Indian population mixed in a way that it had never ever before and never later. That is the interesting question. We'll come to that later. So there is a period of mixing that happened, which is of a thoroughgoing in different extent in different regions, but it's a major mixing that happened during this period. And so what we have to see, and the interesting thing is that this mixing begins to come to a stop around 100 CE, which is around 2000, roughly 2000 years ago. And because in the genetic evidence, you can see people taking to the practice of marrying within their own communities, or what is called endogamy, which is a distinguishing feature of the caste system. So going by genetic evidence, we now have a rough, we now have a rough idea of when the caste system began in a national scale, which is around 2000 years ago. This doesn't mean that there were no, nothing of this nature suddenly comes about. So there would have been much more proto versions of it earlier. But when you say it happened in around 200 CE, what you say is that it goes ballistic, it goes national. From a practice, endogamy may have been the practice of a small subgroup within the migrating steppe pastoralists who arrived here, but not the practice of the entire community who came. But if that was the practice of a small subset, and you can see why that would have been necessary, because we can see in priests in all communities and all religions need to have special reasons for people to pay them respect, whether they acquire it by wearing special clothes or carrying a certain kind of things or claiming various things of descent from this or the other. So priestly classes across all religions, all communities at all times have had to claim various things to get the higher respect, honor, and obedience of the rest of the classes. So it is likely that a small subset had a necessity of saying that we don't mix, unlike the rest of the same community. But if that was, so that's not something that will become visible in a national level genetic survey. What you're saying is that something happened around the beginning of the Common Era, and practically what would have been proto-systems, which were present earlier, expanded dramatically. So why this happened at that time requires more research, because this finding is reasonably new, but I think we need to relook at those periods to see why this happened. It's not surprising all that much, because if we look at the earliest Sanskrit literature that we have, the Rig Veda, you do not see in the entire Rig Veda, there is no mention of the caste system except for one sukta called the Purusha Sukta, which talks about how different castes came from different parts of this Superman, or of the Purusha. Now, if you are looking at it is generally understood. It's a common consensus within the academic community that this particular sutra seems like a much later interpolation, not originally part of the system. So it is something that happened much later. We also have many of the rishis, if you look at, which I mentioned, you will see that you will not see any of their fathers not being known idea, but you will see many of their mothers being known idea. From they're not so what it suggests is that there was significant mixing that happened for a large period of time before something happened around the beginning of the Common Era. We need to, why and how is something that we need to look more into. Okay, we can say that these were the periods around time. I mean, this was roughly the period when some of the Dharma Shastras, including Manusmriti, were written. This was the time when new ideas were coming in. This was the time when, so it is not difficult to believe, but we need more research to understand the process by which this, the system being defined in a larger way and going ballistic or going national happened.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I would like to answer, to go back to an earlier question about the myths. I forgot to mention, I mentioned some myths, but there's an important part of myth making, which today has relevance, which is also important, which is related to history, and which happened because when the idea of nations and nationhood took root in Europe, these nations and nationalisms are recent creations, not more than a few hundred years ago. and they came up in Europe a couple of hundred years ago. And the idea that nations, to be nations, have to have people of same ethnicity, same race, same language, worshipping in the same gods, and things like that. The idea that then therefore it has to be constituted like that. That was the thought that arose then. And once you have that idea of nation and based on exclusivity, then it needs to create myths about that particular nation being ancient, going back to ancient times, has been in existence from thousands or tens of thousands or million years ago. And you create nationalisms, aggressive and exclusive nationalisms of this kind require myths about its own past to create that spirit of nationhood. And this was explained sarcastically and very well by British historian E.J. Hobsbawm, who said historians are to nationalists what the poppy growers in Pakistan are to heroin addicts. We supply the raw material that the market wants. So history, or especially mythical history, is particularly important to aggressive nationalisms across the world. And it's nothing specific to a particular region. It has been so in Europe. And it also leads to, in Europe, we know what happened, which led to 2 world wars until the world turned away from that kind of nationalism. And the world took to what can be called liberal democracies, and which doesn't have the same definition of nation and nationhood as based on a single race, single religion, single language, etc. So here is where new revelations of history and new understandings as we have had comes into conflict with the mythical needs of certain kinds of nationalism, and that we see everywhere. So just wanted to add that, the earlier question.
Okay. Yeah, no, sorry, you want to say something, Sahej?
Yeah, just I was just thinking, like, if we could maybe travel back in time to, if you could take us back to Harappa and like how Harappa, the Harappan civilization itself was not like all the other civilizations that were actually flourishing at the time, and its relationship to, social organization. How were things different, if you could tell us?
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing to, when we are talking about agriculture, this is what agriculture, we talked about how agriculture, we talked about one consequence, which is population explosion and migrations that result in. The other I alluded to, which is that when agriculture happens, there's a surplus because there is more than what is needed. People can produce much more than is needed for them to consume, which means that can be stored if they are cereals, and can be used to hire or to get people to build irrigation works, cities, new temples, all kinds of stuff, new statues. So the possibility that agriculture provides surplus opens up the possibility that there can be new structures of hierarchy, dominance, authority, inequalities that make use of this possibility that you can extract the surplus. You can get slaves to work because they will produce more than what they need to eat. So the surplus leads to these possibilities. And so far, very often we think that these kind of possibilities, therefore, are those structures of dominance, structures of inequality, structures of slavery. All of those things are natural consequences of development of agriculture. But we also know that may be a wrong way of looking at things. There's nothing inevitable about the choices modern humans make. Different people can make different choices. As we ourselves know that agriculture, not everybody who figured out how to cultivate or cultivate plants finally took to agriculture. There are even population groups that took to agriculture and then decided, no, we don't want to go this way. We want to go back. So modern humans can choose. Just because the inequality-led structures of hierarchy has been successful over a larger time doesn't mean that. So in this context is where Harappa comes in. Because you can see that unlike the other civilizations of the time, there are so many things about it that are completely different. And completely different from, say, the civilization of Mesopotamia, with which it was in such close contact, trade contacts. And to that extent that the Harappans even, were players in sometimes of the internecine battles in the Mesopotamian civilization. Even then, the kind of difference that you see between the two is dramatic, which makes you think, we need to, how did these guys, for example, what are the differences? You don't see large statues of kings, unlike in Mesopotamia or other civilizations. There are no pyramids. There are no lavish burials. In Mesopotamia, or you would see kings and royalty being buried, not just with lavish treasures, which are wonderful for the archaeologists because they can understand so much more. You don't find any of that in the Harappan civilization. Not only with precious jewelry and ornaments, but even they were buried with their servants to help them in their afterlife. You do not see any of that in the Harappan civilization. In the Mesopotamian civilization, for example, you can see as agriculture starts happening, and as I said, as the surplus becomes possible, it is not the houses of the people that start becoming bigger. What you start happening is you see temples being, what they call ziggurats, temples being built and they're becoming bigger and bigger and grander. What's happening is that temples are becoming the organizational points for people to get people, because now there are surpluses to be had, to get people to work, to create irrigation works. So who is managing it? It's the whoever is managing to be speaking on behalf of the temple gods or goddesses. So that's the authority structure that is coming in. There are about 32 ziggurats in Iraq and in this region, for example, that have been discovered by archaeologists. There's not one in the Harappan civilization. There's nothing that we can identify as a temple. There's nothing we can identify as this one must have been a palace. And most stunning of all, I mean, so you may think, what about that priest, king, the statues, etc. We don't, in our imagination sometimes, I used to think it's a much bigger thing. It's actually 17.5 centimeters in height and 11 centimeters in width. That's it. And it's not even likely that it's the priest king is just a name. It's neither he may have been a priest because he wears a kind of robe, which in the imagery of Mesopotamia, it has stars, and stars are related to divinity in the Mesopotamian imagery. So it's possible that he was a priest, but whether he was a king, whether they had kings, we have no idea. So this lack of these things is that even that is not the most important thing. The most striking thing, I think, and which has implications, is that in the entire imagery of the Harappan civilization, and there are thousands of imagery on seals, on work on vases and things like that. There's not one that depicts human on human violence. There's violence between humans and supernatural beings. There's violence between humans and animals, all kinds of things. There's violence, but there is no depiction of human on human violence except for one seal, which suggests violence rather than showing violence, which is there's a woman in the middle. It's not clear whether her hand is being held by two men on her two sides or whether she's holding their two hands. But the two men on her two sides have swords in their hands, and above her head, their swords are pointed at each other. Now it suggests, what does it suggest? It suggests rivalry, personal rivalry. But again, even if it suggests violence, it's not suggesting massive societal violence. Are not armies fighting against each other. So this lack of large-scale human-on-human violence put together with the lack of palaces, temples, lack of large statues of kings, it says that this is a civilization and a culture that turned away from glorifying violence. This is not to say that they were not, that the Harappans were not violent. I'm sure they were as more or less, give or take a little bit here or there, they are probably as violent as any other humans. But their decision to not to glorify violence is an important one. And maybe that reduced violence also, who knows? Because we don't see enough large-scale evidence of destruction of their cities often enough to suggest that they were international battles. So their lack of depiction of glorification or glamorization of violence is dramatic when compared to everything else of its time. And this has to be seen in connection with the fact that we don't know how they managed it all. We have no clue. We have no clue. In Mesopotamia, in Egypt, we know what their social systems were, what their governance systems were, who was king, how did it work? There's nothing that we don't know. How did their finances work? There's nothing we don't know. We haven't deciphered the script of the Harappan, and we have no clue about how they managed it. Because remember that this is the largest civilization of its time, as big as the Egyptian and Mesopotamian civilizations put together, 1 million square kilometers in area, which is about a third of the Indian today. And they had much larger standardizations on weights and measures, the way bricks are built across this large region, and the way the cities, grid-like streets, etc., are made when cities are made. And some of the cities are built from scratch up. They did not just grow up like, even our cities sometimes grow like that. They just grow haphazardly over a period of time. A city like Dholavi, some of their cities were built from scratch with planning. So how did that kind of standardization, commonality across multiple factors, and the script which is used across all these regions suggests that from the way that the script is used, what it seems like they had a common language, at least for trade purposes, at least for the purposes of seal making. It's too large a region to have had only one language. But so that is one of the things to keep in mind. So the answer to the question is, they obviously had a very different way of organizing their society than any other civilization that we know about. And it may be wrong to think that it's rather kingly. It was Rabin, and the only thing that we can say is that they had some other way of organizing it, and it is not through one central authority. It must be something that emerged as emergence out of, was it something like, do the earlier JNAF, the republics of the much later period, 1,000 years later, more than 1,000 years later, would they have had something similar? We don't know. But the thing is that Harappan civilization is a reminder that we should not assume that development of agriculture or development of cities necessarily involves domination, inequalities, hierarchies. There could be other solutions, and maybe our ancestors did find some of those solutions.
Thank you. I think that was really fascinating to also know that all these sort of social hierarchies and divisions in a way are more recent. I also had a related question when you were talking about, the scripts that are found on Harappan seals and all of that. It kind of brings us to the idea of language also. Again, like there are many purist claims about the oldest languages and, the purity of languages also belonging to a particular region. So the question was, how do the studies into the origins of language relate to recent genetic research that you have come across? And what does this tell us about the interconnectedness of world cultures?
Yeah, interesting. When we understood, one of the interesting things that I found out is that when you answered the single question, how did the Indian population form? And then you realize that these are the migrations that mainly contributed to the formation. Many other questions which were central and which couldn't be interestingly answered earlier now becomes easily answered. And one of those questions is the language. There are 4 language families that are spoken in India, with not including the Andamanese language or isolates like Brushaski that are spoken in some regions. So there are 4 language families. There's Indo-European languages, which are spoken mostly in northern India, which are languages that are spoken by nearly 3/4 of the people of India, 3/4. And Indo-European languages, which it forms a part of, are spoken by 40% of the people. So Indo-European languages would include everything from Spanish to Iranian to Russian to all of those things. And Indo-Aryan, which is a subset of it, would include all of the North Indian languages, from Hindi to Bengali to Gujarati, all of those. So 3/4 of Indians speak an Indo-Aryan language. About 1/5 speak a Dravidian language, which is a different language family, which is spoken in South India, mostly. There are some exceptions. There are pockets that are spoken again, even in a region in Pakistan today and some parts of Central India, but mostly spoken in South India, Dravidian languages. So third, Austroasiatic languages, which are spoken in tribal pockets in Central India and Eastern India. There is Tibeto-Burman, which is spoken in sub-Himalayan. Now, how did these languages come to be, and how did they get spread the way they are? Now, we can find that answer in the migration histories, especially of the 4 migrations. My book goes into this. It will take too long a time to explain, but my book goes into great detail on why it is likely that the language of the Harappan civilization was a Proto-Dravidian language. And when their civilization declined, they moved both east to the north and south to the South India. But in the North India, the later arrivals of dominant arrivals of pastoralists from Central Asia, who became dominant in the northern region, it caused a language shift in North India from pre-Aryan to Indo-Aryan languages. While in the South, the language continued to thrive as what we see today as Dravidian languages. Austroasiatic languages we see are the result of migrations from East Asia, and that's why they are also spread. And Tibeto-Burman languages are part of the Sino-Tibetan language family, which again goes to spoken in parts of China and many parts of Southeast Asia. All of this related to migrations that caused these languages. It's likely that the language of the Andaman was an original language of the original people who peopled the Andaman Islands. And so that's the broad, but all of these languages, while they belong to different language families, have interacted significantly. And the interesting thing is that the earliest version of Sanskrit that we know, which is the Rigvedic Sanskrit, which is very different from classical Sanskrit, which, even if you know classical Sanskrit, is would be quite difficult for you to follow the Rigvedic Sanskrit. In the Rigvedic Sanskrit, you can see, linguists would say that it has what are called retroflex consonants, ta, da, na, etc., which you will not see in other Indo-European languages, but you will see in the earliest version of Sanskrit we have, and which is more, while these retroflex consonants are an essential part of all pre-Aryan languages, including Dravidian. So what you're seeing is in the earliest version of Sanskrit that we know, we already have the impact of the interaction between the migrants and people who were already here, which shows up as the retroflex consonants. And this is not just, I'm just giving an example. All of these languages have interacted with each other, influenced each other. And 3 of these 4 languages today have connections that goes across both eastwards into the rest of the world and westwards into the rest of the world. And so that's the interconnectedness. And we can also see today the whole of India as, it's both a conversational, the civilizational conversational area where there is much interaction between languages. They influence each other, they borrow from each other. But yeah, if you have to understand how did this four language family come to be, you have to understand the history of peopling of India. Hello? Is anyone there?
Yes, sorry. Sorry. No, that is absolutely fascinating, especially because even for language and Sanskrit, it's always said that it's one of the earliest languages, and it's always said to be sort of really rooted within India. But from what you are saying is that it's not just that we as people are completely mixed, we are migrants from all over. And we are a mix of of a lot of civilizations and histories, but also language. Even like root languages that we consider as Sanskrit and all of that are also sort of, have also gone through these migrational histories and influences. That's what you're saying, right? Yeah. So no.
I think the idea of politics, ideas of nationalism require boundaries to be made to distinguish one group from another. But the more you understand how things really happened, what you understand is that those are constructs, that they don't relate to how things actually happen. This is not very different from the human need, quite apart from modern day nationalisms and so on. The old modern human need to see himself or herself as the center of the universe. That's the only way you can relate to the universe. You will see this in the conception that many modern human population groups have had around the world, and that they all thought that the particular part of the earth that they inhabit is the very center of the world. Not true, because we live on the surface of a globe, and there's no center that you live on. We live neither in the center nor in the periphery. Or many of them thought that they were special children of a special God, unlike the others, or that they have been divinely ordained to rule over everyone else. So these were all concepts that modern human population, long before present day times, have had, and or that the earth is the center of the universe. And all of these things, newer discoveries have had to have demolished. And it has been, at every point of time, it has been a painful process for modern humans to come to realize that this privileging of oneself and one's own community, group, whatever, as the center of the universe creates problems, and it's not the reality. So yeah.
I think we have some time for questions. So maybe, and I can see that a lot of people have written in the chat their questions. So maybe we can take some of those. There's a question by Ajay Dundee saying, thanks, Tony, for this talk. I have a question to ask. Does the existence of multiple gods in the Indian subcontinent provide further evidence that there were multiple migrations into the subcontinent?
Not necessarily. I mean, I don't know that, I do not think you can use that. Even without migrations, it's possible. It's a large country. There could have been people living in different parts who might have had developed newer ideas. So it's not necessarily true. But what I would say is that to understand the multiplicity today, well, you need to understand the migration histories. For example, you will see that we know that the gods and goddesses of the Vedic period are not they get overshadowed by newer divinities that figure much later. I think this is the best way to understand this would be that the earliest Rigvedic, the earliest Vedic scriptures would reflect more the cultures of and as time goes by, what you see is a mixing between different groups, between the people, between the migrants, and which as the genetic evidence also shows. So what you see as new developments are the result of more and more of the pre-Aryan culture being integrated into what has generally seen as the Arya-Sanskrit Vedic culture. For example, in the Harappan Civilization, you can see many many things that remind you of yoga and yogic positions. But yoga and yogic positions are not mentioned in the early Vedas. You had to wait until much later, before they appear in the Vedic literature. So what that suggests is that these are practices that take time to be integrated, and it's a result of mixing. We often forget that the natural result of migrations, wherever it has happened, most of the time, I mean, you can't say, we can't lay it down as a rule in anything in history, because there will always be exceptions, and enough and more exceptions. But you can broadly say that very often what migrations result is not in replacement of one by the other, but in the mixing of them. And the most beautiful example of this is what happened when the steppe pastoralists moved into Europe. When they moved into Europe, what you see in the European archaeological record is a new pottery culture called corded ware, which is ceramics with the markings of a cord or rope around its rims. Now, so now it is seen that corded ware culture is connected to this migration or invasion of the steppe pastoralists into Europe, which is much more violent that we know from archaeological evidence in Europe. But the interesting thing is that you do not find these people who moved into, you do not find corded ware pottery culture in the Central Asian steppe pastoral region from where they moved into Europe. You find it only in Europe. So now, how did this come about? So obviously, this is not something that they brought with them. It took a lot of archaeological digging to arrive at. So how do you explain this? It's interesting, fascinating. It says that these were nomads, right? So they don't have ceramic pottery. It will get broken. So what they used were wooden or leather things in which they can carry things, and very often they had ropes around them. They moved into Europe, and they often took families. They married into or abducted. We don't know which is what, but they mixed with the women of the cultures that they were moving into, who were already familiar with ceramics. So what you see as the pottery culture of the corded ware is that they found it interesting to incorporate the corded ware nature of the utensils that the nomads or the pastoralists, not nomads, pastoralists of Central Asia were using into the ceramics that they were making. So what you see is creation of a new culture, and that's what is the normal result of migrations, and that's what you would expect when you see also. So the answer to the question is that you need this understanding of mixtures to understand the multiplicity and incorporation of different gods, goddesses, belief systems into the system.
Okay, thank you. You can take another question. This is from Ishita Sharma. She says that, are there any differences or signs of social hierarchy or division of population, perhaps in the terms of architecture, across the different stages of the civilization?
Yeah.
And she's asking further whether you had to deal with this idea of historical truth and historical assumptions in the same way that you're talking about fact and myth.
Historical
about fact and myth. So I think the first part is also quite interesting, talking about architecture, whereas the divisions, social hierarchical divisions were reflected in architecture also.
Yeah, I must correct an impression if I gave that, which is that it's not necessarily saying that the Harappan civilization was had no inequalities, etc. I was just raising the question, and I was pointing out that it had significant differences with the others. We haven't yet fully understood it. So to what extent those differences are, there's still some way to go before we fully understand. Interesting question, because there are, as we all know, the architecture of many of the Harappan cities had different lower town, upper town, citadel, etc. And it does look like some of these parts had entrance controls. We are not sure, but there are some suggestion that even some of the seals may have been used for, you need that seal to have access to this part or that part. But it could also be because this part could be dealing with some kind of precious jewelry. They were, they were not burying their dead with precious jewelry, but the precious jewelry that the Mesopotamians were burying their dead with, a lot of it came from the Harappan civilization. So they had all of these things going on as well. So it's possible that it was related to that. But the question is, it's a valid question, but I do not think we yet have a clear answer. And the second question, whether one had to deal with, I had one advantage, which is one is dealing in the sense that I was dealing mostly with prehistory. The advantage or disadvantage of prehistory is that there are no written, this before writing happened, and so there are no written records. You don't know the names of places as they were. You don't know the names of people. You don't know, you can't flesh out any character because you have no details. So there are no written records. So you're dealing only with archaeological, genetic, and other material. I consider it that an advantage because it is a little bit easier, not entirely, but a little bit easier to understand non-textual evidence than textual evidence, because all textual evidence you have to deal with the questions of who wrote it, for whom was it written, what was the objective of that what was being written. So all text needs to go through a critical analysis before you can arrive at what is usable and what is not in a historical manner. All of it is usable in a historical manner, but in a sense of reconstructing what happened. These are questions, and these are not always easy answers to delve into. But broadly, my work, I was driving after answers to questions like who were the Harappans, where did they disappear? And so I would look at all evidence across board. I was not wedded to any particular discipline. So I've talked to scientists and academics from across disciplines. And there were multiple perspectives. Not all of them agreed with each other. And you had to go with one of the things that helped take some of these questions to a conclusion was, as I said, the significant advances that were made by population genetics in recent times. So yes, I did have to deal with them, but I would imagine that's slightly less in the prehistorical period than it will be in the later period.
Thank you. Tony, I was also wondering, one of the research that your book has also included is when you talk about prehistory, how till 10 years ago, we thought that the Neanderthals are kind of inferior to the Homo sapiens, the Homo species, and that we were not at all related to them. But then through some finding just about 10 years ago, it was found that actually, I think all non-Africans have at least 2% DNA or something that your book mentioned, right?
Correct.
So it would be interesting to know what would be the most recent research, because I know that your book also mentions research as early as like a year ago or 2 years ago. So maybe you can go into that. And there's a related question by Sudhir Pandey, which also speaking about, uh, can you please emphasize over the hybridization principles and proportions of the Denisovan ancestry? So I think this in the cultural context, because I think this was also sort of a newer discovery through your book, I think.
Yeah, this is not something that I have followed very closely, but there has been some greater insight into prevalence of Denisovan ancestry, much greater in some of the East Asian groups than earlier had been imagined, etc. But this is not something that I have looked closely into, so I wouldn't like to say more about it.
And one more question maybe we can take. Someone has asked about the discovery of metallurgy and how that influenced migratory and demographic changes in the Indian subcontinent.
One of the things that that I have been surprised by is that there's very early evidence for iron. Every year we get earlier evidence for iron that in India than what had earlier been imagined, often in southern India. But you see significant impact of it. You would think that you would see significant impact of it in terms of agricultural expansion but agricultural expansion, especially in the Gangetic Plain, etc., takes much later. So I think some of this period, I said, these are not periods that I have looked at, because my book ends with the arrival of the last migrants, which is around 1500 BCE. So the Harappans were at the cutting edge of a lot of the all the technologies that we can, including metallurgy. But I think to get to an understanding of metallurgy and its influence, and I think the most important part would be the use of iron and the consequent rise in productivity in the regions, especially in Eastern India, and the rise of the first empires from that region, including the Maurya. So, but those are not periods that I have looked at closely. So I wouldn't be able to say much more on it.
I think that's all the time that we have for questions. But I have just one comment where someone, Rahul Uthale, has written, why aren't such wonderful insights from prehistory not made into mainstream? So I think that's what Tony's book is really doing, because it's very simply written, and it is fascinating. When you read the book, you really do feel that why isn't this? Yeah, we all have our copies, Sahej and I. And I think what we really wanted to do with this talk is also related to the show, and the idea that everyone is sort of mixed, and that was kind of the thrust of our conversation with Tony, and through so I just wanted to thank you, Tony, for doing this for us. And maybe, I know you haven't visited the show, but you've seen some of the photographs, and like I explained before, the show is also trying to do that, about the process of history, how we arrive at making narratives, building narratives. And a lot of them, as you have shown through your research, are complete fiction. And it is still these things that we kind of act on, we make our claims on history or on a place. And I think that's really, really fascinating, because that kind of changes everything. That's the way we act, the kind of validation that we find in the past. And I think that those are the really important ideas that your work completely unravels through such hardcore research and data and statistics and genetic research. And of course, there's this whole area of genetic research that we wanted to ask you about, but we don't have time to go into that. But yeah, I think that's what it is. So it'd be really interesting to also know your views from whatever you have read of our exhibition and seeing the images of.
I think what I like about the concept and even through the kind of impact it makes on one, even by looking at the pictures, is tremendous. I think what I like most about the concept is that I think it forces, it makes the, it makes the viewer or the person who is walking in look at himself as an artifact, because that's the structure in which the whole thing is placed. While usually going to a museum to look at other artifacts, it forces you to look at yourself as a dead artifact and as seen by someone who's, thousands of years later. And I think this reversal of perspective is fascinating, because that's what you expect all art to do, which is to make you introspect. And this makes you introspect about the legacies that you're leaving behind, about what you achieved. So this reversal of the gaze onto the viewer himself, I think is absolutely fascinating. And the multiple perspectives, yeah, when you write history, what you realize is that there will never ever be a book of history that tells the whole story, because the whole story is infinite. There's no end to it. It can't be captured in a book. Maybe if you stay silent and meditate, maybe you can capture the whole history, but there is no way that any book of history will capture the whole story. There is also no book of history that will capture all perspectives, because even we know from even personal events, forget historical events, personal events, if there are 10 people involved in an incident, there will be 10 different perspectives, and not because any one of them tells a lie. They're all being factual. Even then, there are 10 very different, likely to be 10 very different perspectives. So yeah, so I think the best that we can do in these circumstances is to make sure that we stick to where there is possibility of facts, things that happen, whether there is a, whether there is a explosion happened at 70,000 years ago that spread ash all over the region. It's a matter of fact. It can be answered with enough scientific discovery. So I think at least where there are things that are about facts, I think we have to have the discipline to make sure that we go by what science, logic, reason tells us, while keeping in mind always that there is no book of history that would be that is whole and that tells the whole story. And there is no book of history that will take all perspectives.
Oh, thank you so much. That was a really good response. It's true, because the exhibition does make you think about yourself and your own beliefs. So that was really a fantastic response. Sahej, do you want to say something?
Yeah, just thank you, Tony. This was really, really wonderful. I mean, and really crucial. The work that you are doing really reminds us that, we come from a land of diversity, and we are all mixed together, and we have grown through a series of civilizational confluences. This is absolutely I mean, honestly fills me with hope to read your book. And so thank you for being so generous with sharing your ideas and your research with us. This has been an absolute honor. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I think go ahead, Tony.
No, I thoroughly enjoyed this. So thank you very much for.
Thank you. I'm going to end with this last comment that I think is really nice to end with. Someone's written, so all of us on this call, and we are from all over, are in a way related to each other. Isn't that wonderful? So I think that's quite a good end to this. So thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us. If any of you are in Bombay, please do drop by and see the exhibition. It's on till the 8th of May. So thank you so much.
Thank you.